I'd like to introduce our guest for today. We have Zeynep Isik-Ercan, who is the professor of early childhood at Rowan University, and she is also the co-director of the Early Childhood Institute at Rowan University. It's nice to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Sweta. Good to be here.
Thank you. So before we go into talking about culture, I just wanted to ask you if you could give us a little bit of information on the research you do with ECLI and at Rowan University.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm an early childhood professor and early childhood researcher. I'm also the co-director of Early Childhood Leadership Institute, which really provides statewide or region-wide professional development, mentoring, and coaching to early childhood leaders throughout and across different early childhood sectors. And I'm also a researcher. I love doing research in early childhood contexts, families, cultural diversity, immigrants, immigrant children's experiences in early childhood classrooms and early elementary classrooms. Also, I do research in project-based learning, and lately with ECLI work, I've been focusing on leadership and coaching and working through change in early childhood classrooms.
Thank you. And so, as we have established, you are an expert on culture in early childhood classrooms. And so, one of the big questions I wanted to ask you today is, how can we incorporate different cultural perspectives in the early childhood classroom?
Absolutely. So let's start with maybe discussing what culture means to early childhood educators. If you are going to bring it to classroom, what it means to children, right? Because they're going to be shaped with that understanding of how we are different or how people have different sort of lifestyles. So I think when we think about culture, one of the first things that we think about is countries. If we think that somewhat United States does not have a culture, and probably Sweta, you are also from maybe in either immigrant background or maybe your ancestors were, and I'm too, like I'm a Turkish immigrant, first generation. So but when I see in the classrooms, what's happening is in the United States, we act like we don't have a culture, but then people who kind of like look different or dress different or eat different might have a culture. And when we think about culture, people immediately think of different countries. So the first thing that we need to kind of think about is people and young children who are born here or who move here, they actually don't know about their family's culture. So if we're thinking about, especially with immigrant communities, another thing we think about when we think about the culture is, or diversity, let's say, is race and color, right? Like, so we are a very color conscious society. There are jokes about this, there are shows about it, we know how it is. And race, basically, there are certain racial tensions that are stemming from United States' own history that, again, like other people from other countries don't quite sort of like understand once before they move here too. So like it's a different sort of like concept to think about culture. But so my suggestion is that because we're forming children's brains at early ages, and research says that children will form racially conscious opinions or dispositions about each other at an early age, as young as actually 2, that they do really realize a lot of differences about people. That starts with color, that starts with maybe the way that people dress. And then before we address, like if we don't address these at an early age, they become somewhat negative opinions about other people. So if we think about culture, then we need to help children understand what culture is. So, and childcare providers too, right? Like, so programs that sort of like can describe this for themselves and for their families and for their children. And culture to me is like really it's away from just this understanding of countries and race and color, but it's the general more broad notion of the way that we talk, the way that we think, and the way that we experience life on a general daily basis, such as family practices, everyday family practices. So if we define culture this way, we can really understand that every one of us in the classroom have a distinct culture, and even you can think about this as sort of like a local culture. Say you are living in Glassboro. Glassboro has its own culture as a region, but then also your religious affiliation maybe is a culture in its own. And then your sort of like maybe social class, right? Like, so what kind of economic resources or experiences you shared, and then also the way that you actually practice some of your life, your views, your political affiliations, and all of that kind of like forms your culture. So everyone has a culture, and I think what we need to focus on is to think about culture as not in the sense that, okay, I have a couple of African American children in my classroom, or I have a couple of Indian children in my classroom. We should move away from that. We should think about what are some of the ways that we can help children understand our differences as human beings. And wonderful ways that you could do includes life experiences, people's everyday experiences that we all share as humans. So in an article that I'm going to refer, and hopefully you're going to link to this, will be an article that I wrote for young children. And it talked about culturally responsive guidance, positive guidance, meaning like discipline and guidance with children. And some of these guidance issues come from how children really think the life should be, the way that their families practices. So for instance, sleeping practices, right? Like some parents co-sleep with their children, even to later ages. Some people put their children in hammocks, some people put their children on floor beds, some people put their children in cribs. So different, starting from infancy to early childhood, there are so many different ways that we make our children sleep. And childcare programs also have, even though there are regulations, they might have slight preferences in the way that they position children in the physical arrangement of classroom. Like, do you prefer to put the beds in a certain way or in a certain shape in the room? What kind of interactions like you would prefer? So those are all part of the local culture, and countries are even like broader, but we're just talking about United States here. So one of the wonderful ways that could be part of your curriculum is exploring these pieces every day, and every day not really prescribing a certain way of sleeping or living for children, but really exploring and respecting, okay, how do you really sleep? What do your parents do to put you into sleep? And that's part of like a culture. Another interesting thing is I'm being a little bit sort of like different here and pushing our thinking is talk about death experiences. So what do we do? How do we celebrate a person's life when they die? Like funeral. How do we hold funerals? Because kids, even though they're young, they hear about people dying, and what do we do to honor them, right? Like, so that's, I feel like another human experience that everybody practices. For instance, if you had a pet that died, which is a topic that a lot of children will bring to classroom, and sometimes we avoid the topic because it's uncomfortable to talk about. But if a child's pet died, this could be another opportunity to talk about, okay, that how do we lay our dead loved ones to rest, and including pets, but also might include people too, if a child visited a recent funeral, etc. So we can always make these kinds of human connections part of our curriculum, so that we're not necessarily looking at Martin Luther King Day when we think about diversity. We're not waiting for January to explore anything. We are constantly thinking about the way that people are different. And then that kind of approach really does not single out immigrant children, for instance, or Black children, for instance, or children who speak Spanish, because they could be, like when you bring out multicultural days, for instance, or food, or when you say things like ethnic food, you immediately mean that, okay, some children are excluded in this other criteria, and then you have your regular children, right? Like, so
Right.
you should certainly avoid those things and think about like what makes everybody say something, what makes everybody participates, and that does not single out some people as others in the classroom. So I think we need to think about these kinds of like everyday experiences. So that's one thing that I could say. And I think to teach children that how we are all different. And one of the other ideas is that, especially in when you think about early childhood as a mostly woman profession, what we do as women is we're certainly wanting to be inclusive. Like we really wanna, we are social creatures. We bring people together. We have so much care and love to give, and sometimes that means that we tend to think that if we always talk about differences, that will exclude people. But so we avoid these topics. So we think about, hey, let's talk about our similarities and let's be colorblind. Let's not see everything. But the reality is children see differences, and they will, as we know, early childhood educators, they will label things either good or bad, especially in early childhood. So, and they might label people as good or bad, depending on what the criteria is. So I think that's sort of like can be really embedded into overall discussion. One of the pieces that I found so successful in my teaching and practice and working with immigrant families too is that we need to explain to kids that being alone or being different is something cool actually, because that means that you have something additional that other people don't have. One example with that is, instead of calling children who are learning English in a limited language proficiency or even English language learners, we can call them emergent bilinguals. That immediately changes the conversation about the child from being a needy child who is not at the level of others to a resourceful child who actually knows two languages, and other children don't know that those two languages. So that immediately makes people who are looking different or talking different in a more positive light, and that makes them really cool. So that, I think, imagery, right? Like what does it mean to be this or that is so interesting. Another example that I can give you is there are now more recent children's books, picture books, that are talking about nappy hair that represents African American hair that actually is so high quality, but that has historically been a topic of ridicule or insults, like historically, with all of this racism going on. But now, when you have a cultural pride and you think about African American hair as something that is extremely healthy, curly, so beautiful, and think about explaining the hair care protocols to other children, I think that really makes it cool, because that really is an exceptional hairstyle that is so healthy that other people don't have. So really, putting these perspectives in children's minds, even helping them to react to things that when you hear something about other people that that are not positive, how do you respond to that? So if a child really learned about this beautiful African American hair that is so famous and cool now, when they hear like a bullying or an insult, they will immediately respond, or at least think about, no, it's not like this. It's beautiful, it's important. Don't say these things. So I think you're kind of like raising people to be socially conscious and avoid social exclusion when children grow up, because no one starts as racist, no one starts as ignorant, but we let them slide with when they have negative thoughts. So I think for teachers in the early childhood classrooms to be very conscious about these things and not ignoring those, because ignoring those means you're kind of like accepting it and not really putting people on as a stage on target or representing a country again or a culture, because we all are so complex in our cultural identity. I think the last point I want to make is there is a Vivian Gilson-Pelly is one of the traditional sort of like heroes in early childhood literature, and one of her books is called "You Can't Say You Can't Play." Is talking about this idea about avoiding exclusion in the classroom. Like, no groups of children can exclude others in their play based on anything. And that sometimes happens to children who are disabled because they cannot move as well as the others. So in the inclusion classrooms, for instance, those kids can be excluded from play, or some other reason children exclude others, even based on their gender, maybe, so it could be as simple as that. But so this idea about like, how do we make sure that all of us are okay in this classroom, all of us are well and healthy and happy. And I think making this a center of our targets in everyday classroom, making sure that everybody cares for each other, I think you're setting the foundation for a strong society. And then I have, I think, a couple, a couple other pieces, but I think we're short on time. So I'm going to expect if you have any questions or if you need anything, I can be happy to respond.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely include with this link to this audio. We'll include some of the resources that you mentioned. But just to summarize, you'd given so many great points on how to create a different cultural shift in the classroom on how they approach culture, and one is really stepping away from what we seem to use as a cultural basis, the race, the ethnicity, but really deep diving into that connection of us as people with each other. And it seems like once we incorporate that and really embrace each other's differences and the children's differences and the family's differences, it'll help bring a different culture into the classroom and help embrace that idea of diversity in the classroom. And
Absolutely.
is there, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that because in our culture, we really feel, I think, that it's important to be included. And so people actually, even like students or young children, actually sometimes agree to be bullied just to be part of a group, right? Like, so just to be a follower, just to be included. And I think another way that we can really push children is having independent thoughts. You can be alone in your thinking, but it doesn't mean it's bad as long as you're telling the truth or you're on the right side. I think one example for adults is Martin Luther King, for instance, is so loud today, and we even have a national holiday. But did we know that at his time, when Martin Luther King was marching and fighting for social justice and equity, he was one of the most hated people in the US based on current day surveys. So sometimes, we face some consequences in being ethical and in doing the right things. And I think children should learn it. If they think about protecting a child from some of the negative remarks by other children, and because of that other children exclude them, it's the time for a conversation. It's even okay to be excluded, like if you're doing this. And I think children learning that they can have independent thoughts without worrying about how other children or other friends will think is going to be important to raise some intellectual capacities of our children for the future. So those are some of my thoughts. I think for the links, we can also add 2 more resources. One is Anti-Bias Teaching for Ourselves and Our Children by Louise Derman Sparks. And another one is Multicultural Teaching and Learning by Mariana Soto Manning. Both are excellent resources for programs to actually adopt at the child's level the work that is anti-bias, the work that is more inclusive and culturally responsive.
Thank you again for sharing all these thoughts and ideas. I think this will definitely help teachers and directors as they get started on the new school year on how to incorporate these different cultural perspectives in the classroom and how to create a more inclusive classroom in early childhood. So thank you again, Zeynep, for your time. And we will include all the resources Zeynep mentioned, including Zeynep's article with the newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you so much.